Hello, students of World History 1102.7. Welcome to our brave new world. I and most of you are in self-quarantine right now, self-imposed quarantine due to the coronavirus pandemic. And so we're going to be going fully online for the foreseeable future with this class. And fortunately, we're a little bit ahead of the curve with other classes because we've been doing this I've been putting lectures online already on Fridays, so we've become familiar with that. But now we're going to do it all the time. Every class is going to be like that. But we're going to do a couple things differently. First of all, you've noticed already that you've accessed this video in a different way. Cal Poly technical people have asked that I don't put this up onto YouTube, but that I put it up onto the application called Kaltura, which you all have access to, and I have created this link in a Blackboard announcement, and we will move, whenever I put lectures online, they're going to now be they're going to be presented to you in this way, so you're going to access them right from a Blackboard announcement in Kaltura. Now for this week, we're going to do it like we've been doing it before, with the difference being it's not going to be on YouTube, but it's going to be on Kaltura. And so there's going to be about 3 or 4 of these lectures. I will let you know exactly how many. They're going to be a little bit shorter than our usual long Friday lecture. I think it works better that way now that we're going into these into fully online instruction. These videos are going to be, as I said, they're going to be a little shorter, about 15 to 20 minutes. I'm going to try to put up 4 of them each week. At least this week I'm going to put up 4 of them. And of course next week we're going to try something different. Next week what I'm going to try to do, and I'm going to spend a couple days this week learning how to do it. We're going to try to do synchronous teaching. So I'm going to we're going to have the lectures online in real time, and you'll be able to ask me questions. It'll be like a sort of a, what's the word for it, a virtual classroom. And I will provide instructions in a Blackboard announcement to you hopefully by the end of this week, and we're going to start on Monday at 10 o'clock to 10:50. But again, I'll send you notes and instructions on how to do this. And of course, I will load, if those of you cannot make it, who've changed your plans due to the coronavirus and the pandemic and all the changes it's caused in your life, I'm going to also put it up. It's going to be recorded onto in some format, I'm not exactly sure, and I'll throw it up onto a Blackboard announcement in Kaltura, so you'll be able to look at it at any time that is convenient to you, but of course it'll just be a recording, so you won't be able to, there won't be any real-time response or any real-time questions or anything like that. So with that said, I'm going to begin a regular but shorter lecture. We're in week 9, this is on South Asia, imperialism in South Asia. And so let us begin. Don't be surprised as we begin. I'm going to start with a little film clip that will seemingly have nothing to do with our topic, but it will, as I'll explain. Before we go into the specifics of the imperial impact on South Asia and on India, I want to start today with a little discussion about empires in general, and then specifically about the British Empire in India. In next class, we'll move on to discuss a different case. Later, next week, we'll go on to discuss the later case of China. Basically, we'll be examining European imperialism's impact on the two most influential civilizations in Asia. And as we move from India to China, we move from place India, where colonial rule was direct, that is in South Asia, what is now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. We're formal colonies of the British. And then we'll go on to China, which we'll never formally colonize, which retained a government of its own, even if this government was foreign in its own way. The Manchu dynasty of the few hundred years from the 1600s to the 1900s, early 1900s, it was actually a distinct culture from the majority Han culture of China. Still, Europeans and later Japan exercised a great deal of control over China. There were, for example, things like extraterritorial rights for nationals in China, for instance, control over trade, and so on. But before we get into all of this stuff about the impact of imperialism on India and then sort of quasi-imperialism on China, I want to talk about empires in general. What makes for an empire? Are empires as evil as we think they are? How do empires rule? How do they grow? What do empires achieve culturally? Why does history move in the direction of bigness? And what are the legacies of empire? Empires, as that clip from one of the Star Wars movie, I forget which one, get a bad name. I showed you that Star Wars clip for a reason, to kind of get across that empires sort of have a reputation for being evil. And all of you are sort of familiar with Star Wars. We all know the basic story about a plucky republic and the resistance trying to free itself from imperial rule. And of course, how many of us root for the empire to win? Nobody. Obviously, we all root for the republic, for the little guys to win. We all root for Luke and Leia and all the others fighting the empire, because empires have a reputation of evil. But as we're going to see, and let me back up and say, there's a good reason that empires have this reputation. They are ruthless. They crush independent sovereignty. They are aggressive and exploitative. And as we will see when discussing how the British acted in India, all of this opprobrium is well deserved. The British were, quite awful in India. And of course, we already saw how Europeans acted in Africa, where they stole the resources of the continent, steered economic development of the continent to serve their own interests, forced the native peoples of Africa to work for semi-slave prices, of course, for semi-slave wages, forcing them, imposing taxes on them, and when they couldn't pay taxes, requiring that they work on infrastructure projects and plantations in Africa in kind of semi-slavery. This is, of course, even after the slave trade had been ended, when European imperialists moved into Africa. So there's a good reason why empires have an evil reputation. But here's the thing about empires that we have to remember. We are all products of them. To explain what I mean, I'll tell you a little funny story about my son and I. I used to have this joke with him. He was kind of a picky eater, and what I used to joke about was he'd always ask me, what is it in the food that I was making for him for dinner or whatever. And my joke to him was, of course, that the food is made of stardust, because anybody who's taken any kind of astronomy course or physics courses, that the entire universe is made up of the dust from exploding stars, other than hydrogen and helium. The universe is made up, all of it, you, me, your dog, the walls, the air, everything is made up of the materials of exploding stars. So by saying to somebody, what's in something, of course it's stardust, because everything is stardust. Well, if physically speaking we are all made of stardust, then culturally speaking, we are all made of empire. Now, most people like to think of their own culture as distinctive and special, but as we are going to see, most of what we come to know about ourselves is the result of being part of some empire or another. Empires are what all the world, for going back for thousands of years, has been made of, culturally speaking. Let me explain what I mean. To explain what I mean about us all being the product of empire, I want to talk a little bit about a story from Spain. A story from Spain that occurred long before the period we're discussing in this history class. It's a story from the second century BC. But it deals with probably one of the most famous and largest empires in history, the Roman Empire. So it's the year 146 BC, and the third and final Punic War had ended. These were the series of wars fought between Rome and its great Mediterranean rival Carthage. And at the end of this third Punic War, the Russians had utterly defeated the Carthaginians and had eliminated them as an imperial rival around the Mediterranean. The Romans had burned their capital city to the ground. Carthage was burned to the ground. Carthage is now in what is today the modern North African country of Tunisia. They took 50,000 remaining Carthaginian soldiers captive and sold them into slavery. So Rome was moving from triumph to triumph. But there was this one part of Spain where they were also trying to expand into, where they met with something that the Romans weren't typically used to, or they didn't like to experience, and that was defeat. Now, Romans, of course, had met with defeat many times in their history, but that never stopped them, because they would ultimately fight another battle and another until they finally proved themselves victorious. They were relentless in their expansion, relentless in their military aggressiveness, and that is what made the Roman Empire the greatest empire in the Western world in ancient times. But in the decades of the 140s and 130s BCE, after defeating the great rival of Carthage, Rome faced another enemy. And this one was in the northern mountains of Spain. It was a little city-state called Numantia. And it was inhabited by Celtic peoples. The same people kind of inhabited much of the British Isles and northern France at the time. They were a distinct cultural group, part of a larger group, but this particular city-state called Numantia had its own distinct culture. And these people just refused to surrender. The Numantians wouldn't refuse to surrender. They were very proud, very independent. Their city-state was up in the mountains, so it was a little bit easier to defend. And as I said, these people refused to surrender. And the Romans sent legion after legion to defeat them. And they kept getting defeated by the Numantians and sent back packing. And Numantia remained independent. And this remained a thorn in the side of the Roman Empire, and particularly in Spain. Finally, in the year 134 BC, the Roman Senate had had enough. And they assigned Rome's greatest general, Scipio Aemilianus, the man who had led Roman forces against Carthage a dozen years before. And they sent him with a huge 30,000-man army to defeat the Numantians. Scipio shows up, and like all great generals, he tries to come up with the best strategy he can, and he decides that a straight-ahead assault on the walled kingdom of Numantia is not going to work, so he decides that he will just wait them out. That he will besiege the city and surrounding this mountain kingdom's city capital, and just wait them out. Wait till hunger drove them into surrender. And then after about a year of this siege, the Numantians their spirit is broken, they're starving to death. But rather than surrendering, they burn their city to the ground so the Romans can't occupy it, and many of them actually commit suicide and kill themselves rather than become Roman slaves. Now, as you can imagine, the story of the Numantians lived on, and as Spain emerged as a nation-state, one of the first in Europe to do so in the 1400s and 1500s, the early period that we cover in this class, Numantia became a touchstone of Spanish independence and courage. Miguel Cervantes, who wrote the greatest work of Spanish literature, Don Quixote, for example, wrote a play about Numantia's stand against the Romans, as have many other Spanish poets and painters have depicted it in many paintings. Its ruins are a national monument in Spain. It is a source of comic book heroes for Spanish kids, featuring El Jabato, the wild boar, who's an imaginary hero for Numantia. Numantians are celebrated as heroic ideals and the embodiment of Spanish patriotism as role models for Spanish youth. But here's the catch. All that literature and all those comic books are not written in Numantian, of course. They're written in Spanish, which, of course, is a Romance language from Rome, which is from the Latin. They use the Latin script The play Cervantes wrote used Greek and Roman dramatic forms. Numantians did not have theater. All those Spaniards who idealize the Numantians don't pray to Numantian Celtic gods. They pray to the Catholic god, the Roman god. Spaniards don't obey Numantian law. They use laws based on Roman models. They live in buildings styled after Roman forms. In fact, even the story of the Numantians is only known because the Romans loved a good story of freedom-loving barbarians, ultimately, of course, brought under Roman control, and they told the story of the Numantians, passing it down. So basically, the only thing left of the Numantians really are the ruins they left behind. Everything else about how the Spanish absorbed the story of the Numantians, of course, comes from the Roman Empire, the language, the culture, and so forth. Now, empires do, of course, fall. The Roman Empire itself fell, of course, in 476 AD, but they tend to leave behind a much richer legacies. Indeed, as I said, we are all, in a sense, made of the dust of empire, whether it be the Roman Empire, and in many parts of the world, the British Empire, that oftentimes the things we think of as our own unique culture are actually remnants of empire. Just as physically we are all made of stardust, so culturally we are all made of empire dust. Now think of the United States, for example. Our language, our laws, and other things, much of our culture is based on forms that were first projected onto this continent by the British Empire. So this brings us to the question of what exactly is an empire? What differentiates an empire from, say, a kingdom or a city-state? Well, let's begin by defining what does not necessarily define an empire. Now, sometimes we think of empires as always being large, and that we sort of say, well, if it's really big, it's an empire. And in fact, some empires are quite large. The British Empire at its height in the late 19th century, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, encompassed 1/4 of the world's landmass and about 1/4 of the world's people. But if we take a look at another empire, for example, the Athenian Empire of the 5th century BC, it was smaller than modern-day Greece. And in fact smaller even than our own Southern California. The Aztec Empire of 15th century Mexico was much smaller than the modern day country of Mexico. Another thing that does not define an empire is necessarily its origins. If we look at some of the great empires in history, for example, the Assyrian Empire of Mesopotamia in the first millennium BCE, it was war and military conquest. The origins of the Athenian Empire I just spoke of was a voluntary league. Alliances were one of the bases for the Aztec Empire in Mexico. And then, of course, the Habsburg Empire of early modern Europe was created through royal marriages. The other thing that does not define an empire is the type of government it has. Again, looking back at the Assyrian Empire, it was an absolute monarchy, as was the Russian Empire prior to the Soviet Revolution. You could have an empire that was based on a democracy, like the Athenian Empire, or, for example, in the early 20th century, America had its own empire and was a democracy as well. The Soviet Empire of the mid and late 20th century was a communist dictatorship. So the type of government doesn't necessarily define an empire. So if it's type of government, origin, size, all don't really get us to what an empire is, then what, in fact, is a definition of an empire? What makes something an empire as opposed to just a kingdom or a city-state or another form of polity, other form of government? So what defines an empire is really two things. First, an empire rules over disparate peoples with different cultures, different customs, religions, languages, or any combination of these things. How many different ones is open to question, but more than just a few. So, for example, Austria today is not an empire because it just consists of the Austrian people, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire was because it ruled over all kinds of different peoples in Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, whereas Austria today rules over homogeneous German-speaking people who share the same cultural customs. The other thing that the other defining characteristic of an empire is that it has flexible borders and an appetite to expand them and swallow more without changing what the empire actually is. So, for example, today Britain is fixed in its borders, and to expand would have to. If Britain was to expand today as a country, it would really literally change what it was as a country. But 100 years ago, when the British Empire was at its peak, or 150 years ago, it could absorb any place and still be the British Empire. In other words, there was no specific borders of a certain people. It was anything that Britain conquered became part of its empire. And this expansiveness and this ability to absorb all of these different kinds of people, different places, sometimes quite far apart. The British Empire, as it was said, the sun never set on the British Empire because it stretched all the way around the world. So an empire and this expansive ability to absorb all these different people under a single political umbrella, it fuses people together and forges new culture, new imperial cultures that last long beyond the empire itself. And so many of the customs and characteristics of the British Empire have long outlasted it. And this is what makes empires so very interesting. Homo sapiens, us, human beings as a species, we evolved to be xenophobic. That is, we developed as a species as part of a group, a clan, or a tribe. We speak this language, we follow these customs, we worship these gods, etc., etc. This is how our culture existed for thousands upon thousands of years. We saw as our own particular group, we saw as distinct. And it was developed out of the idea that we are responsible for those in this narrow group. Those people over there on the other side of the mountain, on the side of the river, well, they're different. We are not responsible for them. So the people in that other city-state on this other side of the mountains, again, we're not responsible for them. We're responsible for us. In fact, we hold other peoples in fear and suspicion and contempt. And you can see this in the fact that, in various peoples around the world, in all kinds of places, take, for example, Native American peoples, oftentimes define themselves, the name they gave themselves, what we consider their tribal name, actually simply means the people in their own language, as if they were the only people. So again, our history as human beings, through most of it, until the rise of empire, 3,000-4,000 years ago, was very localized, very much about a single identity. We were all sort of culturally similar, and we took responsibility for those who were like us, but we didn't take responsibility for others. They were different. They were on the other side. They were far away. They were in another geographical location, and they were different from us. But empires were and are different. They are inclusive. They encompass all. Yes, there are differences of language and religion, but these are secondary to belonging to the empire. Empire is based on a single set of principles and laws that encompass all people, and that the empire is responsible for all of these people, no matter how different they are, no matter where they are. We're all in it together. In the Roman Empire, we are all Romans. In the Persian Empire, everybody is a Persian. We are all part of this great family. That was what the imperial mission was. Even if, of course, we're not all equal, we are all part of this same system. That is what defines an empire. So this great diversity, this fact that there are no borders that can expand whenever and absorb new peoples without changing its own identity, remains an empire. The other kind of thing that defines an empire is that the empires always try to justify their rule. Some are just ruthless conquerors who admit they are just after plunder. The Mongols, who created the greatest land-based empire in history, covering much of Eurasia, they conquered half the world in the 13th century, but then quickly lost it because they really had no justification for an empire other than plunder. They didn't try to create a common Mongol destiny, and thus after a couple of generations of rulers, the empire quickly fell apart. But most empires create a sort of a larger mission for themselves. We were talking about Africa and the idea that the Europeans had when they conquered Africa and absorbed it into their various empires was that they were bringing civilization and Christianity to Europe. The French called it the mission civilisatrice, the sort of civilizing mission, bringing civilization, proper governance, law, infrastructure, and all that. Now we know it's with Africa, of course, it was mostly BS, because it was really a cover for exploiting these people. But it did try to justify it, and it did try to rationalize its purpose, as this sort of civilizing mission. So again, empires are inclusive. They encompass all kinds of people. They absorb everybody into this one political identity, this one political entity, and then they try to justify it by saying, well, they're spreading civilization, they're spreading culture, whatever. And this is true of the Romans. It was true of the British in more modern times, and it's even been true of the American empire in the early 20th century, and some can even argue sort of the quasi-empire, the pseudo-empire that we have today, the sort of cultural empire that America had, well, not today, in the late 20th century, this sort of, cultural commonalities that we spread around the world in terms of music and film and fashion styles and that sort of thing. But that's, of course, another question completely, something we'll talk about later in the course, this idea of a cultural empire as opposed to an actual political one. But again, political empires have always tried to justify themselves by saying they're bringing civilization to the non-civilized people of the world. And in doing so, empires spread a common culture. That is, they turn the others that they have conquered, they try to turn them into the us, and sometimes they do it quite successfully. Now, why do they do this? One, of course, is simple convenience. It is easier to rule over lots of different people if they all share certain commonalities. For example, a similar written language, even sometimes imposing an oral language on them that can unify the empire. They will utilize the same financial system, the same form of money. Similar laws will exist throughout the empire. Standardization of weights and measures and other things are useful. So there's this idea of standardizing the rules by which an empire operates, standardizing the weights and measures, the money of an empire. It makes it easier to rule a very disparate people, and sometimes, in some cases of empires that are quite large and dispersed geographically, like the British Empire of the 19th century. The other thing ties into that sort of rationalization. The other reason why empires try to spread a common culture is for legitimacy. Imperial rulers believed that adopting their culture was for the good of all those people that were under their control. Sometimes what they spread is useful. For example, standard weights and measures, urban planning, roads, etc. Common law. Sometimes these are actually quite useful for the people they're conquering. Other times it's simply for the matter of control. Taxes, conscription to the army, the emperor worship of ancient Rome was all designed to control the disparate peoples that came under imperial rule. But the point is, no matter what was being spread, the elites, the imperial leadership, believed it was good for those under their control. Not for nothing did the British and the French, or for that matter the Chinese long before them, refer to those they absorbed into their empire as barbarians. It's always sort of the way it is. The empire represents civilization, and those they conquer are the barbarians who will be absorbed and uplifted to this imperial civilization. The Arab empires of the Middle Ages, for example, in Arabic, they would refer to those under their control or those who had adopted Islam as being part of the House of Peace, Dar es Salaam, while those who were outside of their control was considered the House of War. The House of War, also known as Dar el-Harb in Arabic. The Spanish, when they conquered the Americas, of course, also talked about saving souls under the all-encompassing Catholic Church. The British imposed free trade and liberalism. The Soviets with communism. The American Empire with our ideas of human rights and democracy. All empires believe they are spreading good ideals to those they conquer. Now, while some empires tried to impose a purity of culture, most were hybrid. The Romans of ancient times, for example, allowed people to worship all kinds of gods, but they had also to accept the Roman state religion and perform its rites and support it, because religion and politics were very much intertwined in the Roman Empire. Most empires are kind of melting pots. Think of America, but it is not always a pleasant process for those being absorbed. Sometimes the imperial rulers don't accept people as part of their own, treating them as second-class citizens, insulting their culture. Sometimes even those who assimilate are still treated poorly. Sometimes it takes centuries for people to be fully accepted. But the idea is that you're still part of this one system. You still belong to this one political entity. So to summarize, what makes for an empire? First of all, what doesn't make for an empire is specific origin, size, type of government. It can be all kinds of things. In those, it can be all kinds of things that way. But what makes for an empire, of course, as we talked about, to summarize, is a disparate group of people that are all included within the empire, disparate cultures, different religions, different languages, and all that sort of thing. Also, the border, there's no fixed borders. The empires are constantly expanding, and in expanding, don't really necessarily have to change themselves because they are all about absorbing disparate peoples. Are empires as evil as we think they are? Well, as we're going to see in our discussion of India, they can be the British were pretty awful there. Economically exploiting these people, denying them political sovereignty, treating them as culturally inferior. But empires do leave a strong legacy, as we're going to see. How do empires rule? They rule by, imposing, using power that they have to control the people underneath their rule. Empires grow, of course, as we talked about. They can grow in a variety of ways through alliances, royal marriages, conquest. What do empires achieve culturally is, of course, they create a kind of a general common imperial culture, even though allowing for sort of subcultures to continue to exist. But on big questions of law and state religion and that sort of thing, they impose a cultural order on things. Why does history move in the direction of bigness? Well, basically, if you look at the history of humanity, it is a history of people moving from small groups to larger and larger political entities. And even, one could argue today, well, we're a world of nation states, but there's a kind of a general global culture emerging today, as we can see, of course, in our own time, these last few days in the spread of pandemic, that we're sort of part of this larger global culture, sort of showing that history moves in the direction of bigness. And of course, what are the legacies of empire? Well, there are all kinds of things. Again, if you just look at your own self, much of how you identify yourself, whatever specific culture you may have, your identity is shaped by the various empires that have ruled over whatever cultural group you may be part of. And so that ends our discussion sort of empires generally. In the next online discussion lecture, in the next lecture online, we're going to look at India, the British in India itself, how they got there, how their empire evolved in India, and how they came to control India. So stay tuned for that one next. In the meantime, there's going to be a quiz, as usual, at the end of this particular lecture. But don't send me the answers yet. Wait until you see all of the lectures for the week, and then put them all into a single answer sheet for the to submit it. And you should submit it by this Sunday, March 22nd. So you'll submit it by Sunday with all of the answers. So there'll be about 4 or 5 questions for this particular discussion. There'll be 4 or 5 questions on the next lecture, and 4 or 5 questions on the one after that. And if there's a 4th lecture, there'll be 4 or 5 questions there. And so you'll have about 20 questions to answer, and put them all into one MS Word document or PDF document and send that to me. And along with that, I'm going to be posting the writing assignment for this week as well, that I also want you to submit. I sent it to you actually, I already sent it to you on Blackboard. It has to do with that particular document about the Bengals, their response to the British Privy Council, and the testimony to the House of Lords. And so you'll answer question number 2 on that particular reading in about 100 to 150 word little mini answer, and you can attach it to your quiz answers and give it to me all as one document. So thanks a lot. Stay tuned for the next lecture, and stay healthy and safe out there. Bye-bye. I'm sorry, and of course here comes the quiz, and I'll see you, I'll speak to you during the next lecture.